Hey there, sleepyheads, glad to have you back. Before we slip into tonight's tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. The night Riverthorn entered the world, the hospital's power failed, just as the autumn rain began to whisper against the windows. And in that moment of soft darkness, something extraordinary slipped quietly into existence. The backup generator hummed a lullaby no engineer had ever programmed, while candles appeared in gentle hands, casting everything in the kind of golden light that makes strangers feel like old friends. River's mother, Elena, hummed along with a melody she'd never heard before but somehow knew in her bones, a tune that seemed to rise from some deep well of memory and float through the delivery room like silk. Dr. Martinez, who had delivered thousands of babies in her 15-year career, would later tell her husband that she'd never felt anything quite like the moment River took her first breath. The air itself seemed to soften, becoming more forgiving, charged with a peace that usually only visited in the deepest dreams. As River's tiny cry filled the room, not the usual indignant wail of newborns, but a sound gentle as morning mist, a peculiar warmth began to diffuse through the building, touching everyone in its path like the glow from an unseen hearth. The nurses moved with unusual tenderness, speaking in hushed tones, as if witnessing something sacred rather than simply medical. Even the anxious fathers pacing in the waiting room felt their shoulders relax without knowing why. What no instruments could measure was how River's arrival sent gentle ripples through the invisible landscapes that lived inside every person in that hospital. 3 floors up, an elderly man scheduled for heart surgery felt his fear ease for the first time in weeks. In the pediatric ward, a mother keeping vigil beside her sick child suddenly found herself able to breathe deeply again. River herself lay in her mother's arms, not crying or thrashing as newborns typically do, but listening with an intensity that seemed impossible for someone only minutes old. Her dark eyes moved as if tracking something just beyond ordinary sight, and her tiny fingers reached toward empty air with the confidence of someone grasping for something real and solid. To her nascent senses, each person in the room was not merely flesh and bone, but a vast, quiet landscape, an intricate park of memories and feelings that existed in the spaces between heartbeats, woven from threads of joy and sorrow, hope and gentle fear. She sensed the rolling hills of her mother's love, the shadowed corners where the doctor kept his long days and sleepless nights, the bright streams of the nurses' quiet compassion flowing like music through their tired hearts. These were not places one could walk into with boots and a map, but ethereal territories that River, even as an infant, navigated with an instinct born of something deeper than understanding. As dawn painted the sky in soft pastels and the power hummed back to life, the hospital staff began to forget the unusual peace that had settled over the building. But Elena remembered, watching her daughter with wonder as River continued to listen to whatever symphony only she could hear, her breathing synchronized with rhythms that seemed to echo from the very foundations of the world. In her tiny hands lay the beginning of a gift that would grow as gently as flowers opening to morning light. The ability to tend the secret gardens that bloomed inside every human heart. The months that followed River's candlelit arrival unfolded like pages turning in a book written in a chi language only she could read. While other toddlers reached for bright plastic toys that clattered and sang, River gravitated toward the quiet corners of her parents' bookshop, where dust motes danced in afternoon light and stories whispered from every shelf. Her small hands preferred the weight of thick crayons and the patient surface of drawing paper that received her marks. Like earth receiving rain, Elena and Theo Thorne watched with gentle bewilderment as their daughter developed what they lovingly called her impossible geography. By age 3, River could sit for hours on the worn rug behind the counter, her dark brow furrowed in concentration as she created elaborate maps of places that existed nowhere on any atlas, yet felt more real than the floorboards beneath her knees. These weren't the stick figures and crooked houses that typically decorated refrigerators, but intricate landscapes complete with winding pathways, hidden clearings, and tiny benches placed with the precision of someone who had walked every route. She labeled her creations in careful, wobbly letters that grew steadier with each passing week. There was grandmother's laughter stream, a shimmering blue ribbon that curved around clusters of yellow circles she called memory flowers. Papa's Worry Woods appeared as a tangle of gentle brown lines with small clearings where she drew benches, explaining to Theo in her matter-of-fact toddler voice that everyone needed places where their sad thoughts could sit down and rest. For Elena, she created Mama's Calm Meadow, a vast green expanse dotted with tiny glowing flowers, each one representing a kind word or gentle touch. The bookshop's customers began to linger near River's latest creations, something stirring in their chests as they recognized landscapes they'd never seen but somehow knew intimately. Mrs. Chen, from the flower shop, would pause before a map labeled, "The Garden Where Lost Things Grow," tears gathering in her eyes as memories of her late brother surfaced like flowers after rain. Mr. Patricia, the usually gruff mechanic, spent 20 minutes studying River's drawing of the workshop of second chances before quietly purchasing a book of poetry he claimed was for his wife. What Elena and Theo couldn't yet understand was that their daughter wasn't simply creating charming fantasies. River was mapping the actual emotional landscapes she sensed within every person who crossed her path, the vast, quiet parks that existed in the spaces between heartbeats, territories of memory and feeling that most people carried without ever realizing their beauty. Each drawing was her attempt to translate the invisible geography of human hearts into something the ordinary world could witness and recognize. The winding rivers in her maps represented the currents of joy and sorrow flowing through people's inner worlds. The forests weren't dark or frightening, but necessary sanctuaries where deep thoughts could process and heal. The meadows showed where people felt most themselves, and the benches offered rest for weary emotions. River navigated these territories with the confidence of someone who had always known they existed, her small hands already learning to tend the secret gardens that bloomed inside every human heart. As autumn painted the bookshop windows in shades of amber and gold, River's maps grew more detailed, more precise. She was beginning to understand that some paths would open only when invited, that certain gardens needed patient tending, and that the most beautiful landscapes were often the most carefully guarded. Her gift was growing as gently as morning light, preparing her for journeys deeper than anyone could yet imagine. Winter River turned 5 brought more than snow to the bookshop. Windows, it carried the quiet crisis that would transform her gift from observation into action. Whiskers, the grey tabby who had claimed the philosophy section as his throne since before River could walk, began moving with the careful deliberation of someone carrying invisible weight. His purr, once a constant rumble that customers swore made books more readable, faded to barely a whisper, and his favorite patch of afternoon sunlight remained empty day after day. Dr. Hendricks delivered the news with the gentle directness that veterinarians learn through years of breaking hearts carefully. Whisker's kidneys were failing, his ancient body preparing for the great journey that all living things must eventually take. Elena's eyes filled with tears she tried to hide, while Theo's hand found River's shoulder, with the weight of someone preparing to explain loss to a 5-year-old. But River listened to these adult words with solemn attention, her small hand already resting on Whisker's head as he lay curled in his diminishing warmth. That evening, the snow began to dust the windows like powdered sugar. River made a decision that felt as natural as breathing. She carried Whiskers to her small bed, settling him gently on the quilt her grandmother had stitched with scenes of gardens and winding paths. The symbolism wasn't lost on her, though she couldn't have explained it, only that it felt right, like placing him on a map of where they were going together. As the house grew quiet around them, River curled her body protectively around the ailing cat, whispering promises in the language of hummed melodies and gentle touch. Sleep came like a tide, and with it something unprecedented happened. Instead of simply sensing the inner landscapes of others, River found herself standing within one, as real as the floorboards beneath her bed, yet made of something far more precious than wood and nails. Moonlight painted everything in silver, illuminating a park where trees grew with bark that shimmered like starlight and branches heavy with luminescent flowers that chimed softly in a breeze, carrying the scent of contentment and old adventures. River understood without being told that this was Whisker's inner world, the secret park that had been growing inside him through years of sunny windowsills and gentle hands, midnight prowls and afternoon naps in the company of books and quiet humans. At the heart of this ethereal territory lay a small garden, and there River found what she had somehow known would be waiting. Pain grew like thorny weeds among flowers of memory and joy, and patches of dry earth spoke of the weariness that had been settling in Whisker's bones. River knelt in soil that felt like moonbeams and began to work with hands that seemed to know exactly what to do. She pulled the weeds of hurt with infinite gentleness, her touch dissolving them into stardust that scattered on the silver breeze. Where they had been, she cupped her hands and poured invisible, shimmering water onto the thirsty earth, tending it as if it were the most precious garden in the world. As the water soaked in, tiny flowers began to unfurl, not luminescent like the others, but vibrant with soft hues that smelled of comfort and peace. When morning light filtered through the bedroom curtains, River woke to find Whiskers purring against her chest with a strength that had been absent for weeks. His eyes held a peace that seemed to glow from within, and dirt clung mysteriously to River's fingernails, though she had never left her bed. On her tongue lingered the faint, sweet taste of starlight, and in her heart, the quiet certainty that her gift had grown beyond maps into something far more profound. The weeks following Whiskers' miraculous recovery carried a new weight of understanding that River felt in her, bones like the approach of changing weather. She moved through her days with the quiet reverence of someone who had touched something sacred and knew it could happen again. At school, she found herself watching her classmates with different eyes, sensing the shimmer of hidden parks just beneath their playground laughter, and whispered secrets, though she kept this awareness tucked close to her heart, like a letter meant for later reading. It was in the library's hushed corners that River's gift would find its first true guide. Mrs. Holloway had been the school librarian for more years than most could remember, long enough to recognize the subtle magic that sometimes bloomed between certain children and the stories that called to them. She noticed how River approached the shelves with the careful attention of someone entering a cathedral, her small fingers trailing along book spines as if reading narratives that existed beyond the printed words. On a February afternoon, when rain drummed gentle fingers against the library windows, Mrs. Holloway found River sitting cross-legged beside a shelf of forgotten poetry, her palm resting on a leather-bound volume, eyes closed in deep listening. The librarian approached with the soft steps of someone who understood that some moments deserved protection from sudden sounds. Reading without opening the cover, are we, dear one? Mrs. Holloway's voice carried the warmth of someone who had been waiting years to ask this question. River's eyes opened, dark and clear, meeting the librarian's gaze without surprise or fear. "It's singing about a garden where memories grow like flowers," she whispered, her voice barely disturbing the library's peaceful breath. Mrs. Holloway's expression softened with recognition, and she settled into the chair beside River with the careful grace of someone whose bones carried decades of wisdom. "I used to hear them sing too when I was young," she said, her voice taking on the quality of shared secrets, the places that live inside people, the quiet parks where hearts keep their most precious things. Something shifted in the air between them, a door opening on silent hinges. River nodded slowly, understanding that this conversation was as sacred as the territories they were discussing. Mrs. Holloway spoke of her own childhood gift, how she had once been able to visit the inner landscapes of others. Though the ability had faded with age like old photographs losing their color, every person's heart is sacred territory, Mrs. Holloway whispered, leaning forward, as afternoon light painted golden squares on the worn carpet. "You must never enter without permission, and once inside you are a gardener, not an architect. You can tend and nurture, but you must never force change." As winter light faded beyond the windows, River absorbed these lessons like earth receiving gentle rain. She learned that wilted flowers often meant old sadness, that overgrown paths indicated confusion, and that the presence of small animals usually meant someone was ready to trust again. Mrs. Holloway explained that River's role was not to fix people, but to help their inner worlds remember how to bloom. From that day forward, their Tuesday afternoons became a quiet classroom where wisdom passed between generations like tea poured from an old pot into willing cups. River had found her first teacher in the geography of human hearts, and together they would explore the invisible rules that governed the secret parks blooming inside every soul. Through the gentle months that followed her first lessons with Mrs. Holloway, River discovered that her gift operated according to laws as natural and immutable as the changing seasons, though written in a language that existed somewhere between starlight and whispered prayers. These rules revealed themselves gradually, like flowers opening to morning light, each one carrying the weight of ancient wisdom that seemed to flow directly from the source of all healing. The first and most sacred principle settled into River's understanding, like water finding its level. Permission was everything. She could only enter someone's inner park when they were in deep peace or sleep, their conscious minds quieted enough for the subtle invitation to emerge. But even then there had to be something more, a soft resonance, an unspoken willingness that felt like a door left gently ajar. Mrs. Holloway taught her to sense this invitation in the rhythm of sleeping breath, the way shoulders released their daily burdens, the almost imperceptible softening that said yes without words. River learned this lesson intimately through practice with her own family. On drowsy Sunday afternoons, when Elena dozed on the bookshop couch with a novel tented over her chest, River would ask softly if she could tend the meadow of calm her mother carried. Elena's sleepy smile and gentle nod became River's first conscious invitation, and as she rested her small hand on the edge of the blanket, the world would thin and the meadow would unfold around her. Gentle grasses swaying with contentment, bell-shaped flowers that chimed when kindness moved through Elena's day. The parks themselves became River's most patient teachers, revealing their symbolic language through seasons of careful observation. Wilted flowers whispered stories of old sadness, their drooping petals asking not for resurrection, but for gentle witness to their beauty even in decline. Overgrown paths revealed confusion and lost direction, brambles of uncertainty that needed patient clearing rather than violent cutting. When small animals appeared, rabbits nibbling at meadow edges, birds perched on garden benches, cats curled in patches of sunlight, River learned to recognize them as signs that the person's heart was preparing to trust again. One evening, when Theo fell asleep in his reading chair with a pencil still behind his ear and worry lines drawn between his brows, River whispered her request to tend his worrywoods. The landscape that welcomed her held honest shadows and winding paths marked with the debris of daily concerns. River didn't try to chase away the shadows or force light into every corner. Instead, she laid smooth stepping stones along the main path and hung a simple lantern at a crossroads, offering guidance without direction. When Theo woke, he found himself scribbling a note he couldn't quite explain. Felt company in the quiet, like the good kind of weather. Not every attempt brought such gentle success. Eager to help a classmate who cried easily at school, River once tried to move a heavy stone she found blocking the girl's inner pathway. The stone bore a label with feelings River didn't yet have words for, and as she pushed against it, a cold wind rose and the path disappeared entirely beneath her feet. She woke with her heart racing, cheeks hot with the recognition of her mistake. Mrs. Holloway smoothed the lesson with calm hands the next day. We do not pry up the roots of what gives a person their shape, dear one. We sit beside the stone. We bring a thermos of patience. We wait for the season that loosens it naturally. From these experiences, River absorbed the fundamental truth that her role in these sacred spaces was never to impose her vision of healing, but to serve as a gentle presence that reminded each landscape of its own capacity for growth. She was a gardener who worked with moonbeams and intention, watering what wished to bloom, clearing paths that wanted to be walked, but never forcing flowers to unfurl before their season, or demanding that winter gardens immediately become spring meadows. Mrs. Holloway helped. River named the rules in simple language so they wouldn't be forgotten. Ask and wait. Enter only when the breath says yes. Carry a lantern, not a blueprint. Water, don't carve. Leave every place kinder than you found it. Bring yourself home before dawn. The librarian gave River a tiny silver bell on a ribbon to wear when she slept, a gentle reminder that if a dream turned stormy, she could listen for its soft chime and follow it back to safety. As spring painted the world in soft greens and filled the bookshop with the scent of new beginnings, River copied these principles into a crescent-shaped notebook that she kept beneath her pillow. She fell asleep most nights with one hand resting over its cover, feeling the world inside herself and the world inside others, breathing in synchronized rhythm. Each visit taught her a shade of gentleness she hadn't known existed, and each morning brought proof in the smallest ways: a deeper inhale from her mother, a lighter step from her father, patient smiles that bloomed where worry had been the day before. River was becoming a keeper of secret gardens, a tender of inner landscapes, someone who helped hearts remember their own wild capacity for healing. The rules were written not in books, but in the language of growing things, and she was learning to read them with the fluency of someone born to tend the invisible. Parks that bloomed inside every human soul, the transition from elementary certainties to middle school's shifting social terrain brought River face to face with landscapes more complex than any she had yet encountered. And it was there, in the fluorescent-lit hallways of Northwood Middle, that she would meet Marcus Chen and learn that some inner parks required not warmth, but the patient appreciation of their own stark beauty. He sat 2 rows ahead in Mrs. Peterson's English class, a quiet presence who moved through conversations like someone walking through snow that only he could see, his dark eyes holding depths that seemed older than his 12 years. River noticed how silence gathered around Marcus, not the uncomfortable kind that begged to be filled, but the profound quiet that follows after something important has been said and the world is still listening. When other students partnered for projects, his gaze would slip sideways toward the windows, practiced in the art of becoming invisible before kindness could ask anything of him. River felt the familiar stirring in her chest, the gentle recognition of an inner landscape that called to her gift. Though this one seemed wrapped in a season she hadn't yet learned to navigate, their first real conversation happened during lunch, when River found Marcus sitting alone with a sketchbook, drawing bare trees against a gray sky with such careful precision that she felt compelled to ask about the story behind them. He looked up with surprise, as if he'd forgotten other people could see him, and after a moment's hesitation, showed her the full page, an intricate winter landscape complete with frozen ponds and snow-covered benches. "My sister Emma used to say that some feelings need their own weather," he said quietly, his voice carrying no self-pity, only the matter-of-fact acknowledgement of someone who had learned to live with permanent winter. River understood immediately that he was speaking about more than art, and when she nodded without trying to fix or change what he'd shared, something in Marcus's shoulders seemed to ease by the smallest degree. Over the following weeks, River learned about the car accident the previous spring that had taken Emma, Marcus's younger sister and closest companion, leaving behind not just grief, but a fundamental shift in how he moved through the world. His parents, drowning in their own sorrow, had become gentle ghosts in their own home, and Marcus had learned to carry his loss quietly, not wanting to add weight to their already bending backs. It was during a study session at River's house, when Marcus finally relaxed enough on the bookshop couch to fall into deep, trusting sleep, that River felt the invitation she'd been waiting for. His breathing grew soft and even, and in that peaceful surrender, the air thinned with permission. The landscape that welcomed her took her breath away with its austere beauty. Everything existed in shades of silver and white, bare branches reaching like prayers toward pearl-gray sky, frozen ponds reflecting clouds like captured dreams, snow covering every surface in gentle drifts that muffled sound and required deliberate movement. This wasn't a park trapped by grief, River realized, but one that had found its own way to honor loss, creating sacred space where memories could rest undisturbed. Instead of trying to bring spring, River learned to appreciate winter's gifts. She built small snowmen in quiet corners, not demanding joy but simply holding space for sadness. She lit gentle fires that offered warmth without trying to melt the entire landscape. And most importantly, she walked through his winter park with reverence, letting her presence say what words could not, that someone could witness his grief without needing to fix it. When Marcus woke, he found River reading quietly nearby, and something in her peaceful presence seemed to surprise him. "I dreamed someone was walking with me in the cold," he said softly, "but they weren't trying to make it stop being winter." River smiled and handed him a warm cup of tea. "Sometimes winter is exactly what a heart needs," she replied, and tiny green shoots of trust began pushing through the snow, the quiet friendship that had grown between River and Marcus. Through his winter of careful healing, opened her, awareness to the subtle ways that creativity and loss could interweave, preparing her for Ms. Chen, whose art classroom would become River's next classroom in the geography of human hearts. Ms. Chen moved through the bright studio space like a living brushstroke, her dark hair streaked with premature silver that caught afternoon light, her hands perpetually stained with colors that seemed to glow from within, speaking of composition and light with a passion that made even reluctant students reach for their brushes with newfound courage. River enrolled in the after-school art program, partly to continue creating her emotional maps, but mostly because something in Ms. Chen's presence stirred the same gentle recognition she felt when approaching sacred spaces. There was a depth to the teacher's encouragement, a way she could look at a student's tentative brushstroke and see not just what was there, but what was trying to emerge, waiting for permission to become visible. As weeks passed, River began to notice the careful boundaries Ms. Chen maintained around certain subjects. When students asked about her own artwork, the teacher's smile would soften with something that looked like longing mixed with old resignation. A locked cabinet in the corner of the room seemed to draw Ms. Chen's gaze during quiet moments, her fingers sometimes hovering over its handle before she turned away with practiced dismissal. "I used to paint," Ms. Chen shared one evening as they cleaned brushes together, her voice carrying the weight of dreams carefully folded away. "But teaching became my canvas instead. Sometimes we redirect our rivers to water other people's gardens." River understood that Ms. Chen had once been a practicing artist. Her creative fire gradually banked and channeled into nurturing others' artistic growth, while her own work remained locked away behind doors, marked with practical concerns and accumulated doubts. The invitation came on a Friday evening when Ms. Chen fell asleep at her desk while reviewing student portfolios, exhausted from giving her creative energy to others while denying it to herself. Her breathing grew deep and peaceful, defenses softened by fatigue and trust, and River felt the familiar thinning of the world that meant respectful entry was possible. The landscape that welcomed River was breathtaking, vast galleries stretching in every direction, their walls lined with paintings that moved like living memories, sculptures that hummed with inner vibration, and gardens where ideas bloomed like luminescent flowers. This was the wellspring of Ms. Chen's boundless creativity, a testament to artistic vision that had never truly died but had been carefully contained. Yet throughout this magnificent territory, River found locked doors marked with old disappointments and practical necessities. Instead of trying to force them open, River followed the lesson Marcus's Winter Park had taught her about the dignity of witnessing without changing. She sat quietly outside the heaviest door, her presence a gentle reminder that someone saw the beauty being kept in darkness, that the galleries behind those barriers held treasures worth honoring regardless of whether they ever found their way into light. When Miss Chen stirred awake, she found River arranging art supplies nearby. Something in the teacher's expression had shifted, a door breathing easier though she might never name why. The following week, she brought out brushes she'd kept tucked away and asked students to try painting with tools that carried stories of other creations, and the room felt for a moment like a soft museum where nothing had to be defended. The gentle changes River witnessed in Ms. Chen's renewed relationship with her brushes taught her something that would become the cornerstone of her gift. The most profound healing happened not through dramatic intervention, but through the patient art of bearing witness to someone's inner landscape without needing to rearrange its seasons. As River moved deeper into her teenage years, this understanding crystallized into a practice as natural as breathing, transforming her from someone who visited inner parks into someone who embodied the very peace those landscapes sought to cultivate. She learned to approach each person's emotional territory with the reverence of someone entering a cathedral, understanding that her role was not to be an architect of change, but a gentle gardener who tended what was already growing. When she encountered the frozen lakes of grief that seemed to define so many teenage hearts, River discovered the profound gift of simply sitting beside the ice without trying to melt it, bringing warm blankets for the benches nearby, and trusting that spring would arrive in its own perfect timing. Her classmates began gravitating toward her with the instinct of plants growing toward light, though they rarely spoke directly about what drew them. Sarah Martinez, wrestling with college anxiety, would find herself seeking River's company during study sessions, somehow feeling her own racing thoughts slow to a manageable pace in River's calm presence. When Jake Thompson's parents divorced, and his anger built walls around his heart, River learned to tend the small garden of kindness that still bloomed in his most protected corners, never mentioning the thorny barriers, but consistently nurturing the tender shoots that wanted to reach toward awe. Understanding. River developed an intuition for reading the language of slumped shoulders and restless hands, the way certain silences asked for company, while others needed solitude. She discovered that healing was less about solving problems and more about creating conditions where natural resilience could remember itself. Her gift lay not in providing answers, but in lighting small lamps along overgrown paths of confusion, trusting that each person carried within them an innate wisdom about their own healing journey. Through these experiences, River learned to cultivate her own inner sanctuary with the same gentle attention she brought to others. She planted groves of rest near the places where responsibility liked to camp, and she kept clear streams running so that her constant giving wouldn't drain her dry. She learned the shape of her limits not as walls, but as shorelines that kept her inner sea from swallowing everything, understanding that caring for others required first tending the caretaker within herself. As her practice deepened, people began telling her unprompted that being with River felt like standing under a protective tree while rain passed overhead. Friends would lean against her shoulder and fall asleep without apology. Strangers on buses would exhale and not know why. River felt gratitude more than pride, like a gardener grateful that soil remembered what to do when given patient attention and unconditional respect. The more she practiced this gentle presence, the more River understood that she was learning something essential about the nature of healing itself, that it happened in relationship, in the sacred space between one heart and another, where witness and compassion could work their quiet magic without force or urgency, as natural and necessary as morning light touching sleeping flowers. River's deepening practice of gentle presence drew her naturally toward places where healing was both profession and calling, leading her to volunteer at Mercy General Hospital during the summer before her senior year. The building hummed with a different energy than the quiet bookshop or peaceful library. Fluorescent lights cast everything in clinical brightness. Machines spoke in steady beeps like mechanical heartbeats, and the hallways breathed with the measured rhythm of people learning to mend. It was there, folding blankets into neat squares that looked like small clouds, and learning the names of equipment that monitored the invisible workings of human bodies, that River encountered Patricia Nguyen. Patricia moved through the cardiac ward with a serenity that seemed to defy the controlled chaos surrounding her. Her steps made no sound on the polished floors. Her voice carried the kind of calm that could settle a room like dusk, settling over a field. And her hands held the steady warmth that reminded frightened patients how to breathe deeply again. River watched with quiet fascination as Patricia seemed to read the emotional weather of every room she entered, adjusting her presence like a skilled sailor reading wind patterns, becoming an anchor for anxious families, flowing like gentle water around confused patients' fears, offering colleagues the kind of support that felt like coming home after a difficult journey. One evening, after a particularly demanding shift, when the ward felt heavy with worry, and River found herself moving slower than usual, Patricia appeared beside her with 2 paper cups of water and a knowing smile. "Come," she said softly, nodding toward the small staff garden visible through the break room windows. "If you're going to keep giving, you'll need to learn how to pour without emptying yourself." As they sat on a weathered bench surrounded by herbs that the day shift nurses tended between emergencies, Patricia shared wisdom that would reshape River's understanding of her gift. "We hold a hand without carrying the whole arm," she explained, her voice gentle but clear. "We witness pain without making a home inside it. We step out of rooms and leave the weight where it belongs." She taught River a ritual as simple as washing hands, warm water, slow breath, imagining the day's stories flowing off skin like silt loosening from a riverbed, not to forget people, but to let their sorrow find its own path back to the sea. When Patricia finally dozed during a rare quiet break, curled in the corner chair with the trust of someone who had learned to rest deeply, even in busy places, River felt the familiar invitation to visit her inner landscape. What she discovered was a revelation of conscious organization, a healing garden where different areas were clearly designated and lovingly maintained. Work stress had its own meadow, where concerns could graze peacefully until shift's end. Family joy bloomed in protected gardens that remained untouched by professional demands. And personal dreams grew in greenhouse spaces that received daily attention regardless of how exhausting the night had been. Gates stood at every entrance, beautifully crafted and firm, each bearing a sign in gracious script, "Open with intention, close with thanks." River understood that boundaries were not walls, but well-placed hedges that kept tender things safe to grow. Healthy membranes that allowed compassion to flow while preventing complete absorption of others' suffering. "Your presence is the gift," Patricia reminded her the next evening as they walked the hospital's quiet corridors. "Not your ability to fix or change, but your capacity to remain steady while others remember their own strength." River began creating her own transition rituals, designating benches in her inner park for each shift, keeping small lamps lit near places where worry gathered, learning that the deepest service came from maintaining her own center so completely that others could find their way back to theirs. The wisdom Patricia had shared about maintaining sacred boundaries while offering deep presence prepared River's heart for intimacy in ways she wouldn't fully understand until Jaime arrived, carrying melodies in places where most people kept silence and moving through the world with the fluid grace of someone who heard music in the spaces between ordinary sounds. Their paths crossed during River's final year of high school, in the library's quietest corner, where afternoon light painted golden rectangles across worn carpet and the distant hum of the building created its own gentle symphony. Jaime sat near the poetry section with a notebook full of half-finished songs, humming melodies so soft they seemed designed to tuck listeners into peaceful dreams rather than wake them to excitement. River noticed how people's shoulders relaxed when Jaime played guitar during lunch, how even the librarian would pause her cart pushing to listen, and how conversations naturally found their rhythm around the gentle music that seemed to flow from Jaime like warmth from a well-tended fire. They spoke first about favorite records and the strange comfort of late-night radio. Jaime describing how melodies sometimes arrived at inconvenient moments, like shy birds, that only landed when the world grew quiet. River found herself offering silence as a gift, and Jaime accepted it not as emptiness, but as sacred space where music could breathe and grow. Their friendship deepened through shared understanding of sensitivity, both creating languages for experiences that couldn't quite fit into ordinary words. The evening Jaime finally asked about River's gift, they were sitting on the bookshop floor after closing, surrounded by River's emotional maps, and sharing the last triangle of a late-night sandwich. "You tend something in people, don't you?" Jaime said, their voice carrying the same gentle certainty they brought to their music. "I can sense it sometimes, like you're tuning instruments that have been sitting silent." River felt her heart skip with the surprise of being seen so clearly, and when she shared her secret about visiting inner parks, Jaime listened with wonder rather than disbelief. "If you ever wanted to visit the place where my songs come from," Jaime whispered that night, reaching for River's hand with care that acknowledged the worth of gentle things, "I think I could open the door." It felt less like a request and more like two hearts breathing toward one another, creating space for something beautiful to unfold. When Jaime fell asleep that evening with the trust of someone who had found their safest harbor, River felt an invitation unlike any she had received before. This wasn't just permission to visit, but conscious collaboration, Jaime's dreaming mind actively welcoming her presence into territories usually kept private. The landscape that received River was alive with music in ways she had never imagined possible. Trees chimed softly when wind moved through branches that seemed strung with silver threads. Streams babbled in perfect harmonies that reminded her of hands finding one another in darkness, and meadows filled with wildflowers swayed to melodies that rose from the earth like gentle prayers. Small bells hid throughout the terrain like dewdrops, chiming when thoughts became honest, and pathways pulsed with subtle rhythms that guided visitors toward different emotional territories. River discovered that love could be both profound and playful, serious as cathedral music yet light as morning birdsong. She learned to move through Jaime's musical park with reverence for its unique beauty, adding her own gentle harmonies without trying to change its essential nature. When Jaime woke to find River humming a melody neither had heard before, but both somehow knew, they understood their connection had deepened into something rare, a love that honored both shared spaces and individual territories, creating harmony without requiring either person to lose their distinct voice in the larger song they were learning to compose together. The gentle harmony River had discovered with Jaime, like two melodies learning to dance together without losing their individual voices, created a foundation of trust that would prove essential when life asked her to witness the most sacred transition of all. It arrived with the soft inevitability of autumn. As her grandmother Elena, the same woman who had hummed unknown lullabies in candlelit hospital rooms, began the slow, graceful process of preparing her heart for a different kind of journey. Elena had always been the family's quiet lighthouse, her small apartment filled with the scent of lavender sachets and the patient ticking of clocks that had measured decades of gentle devotion. When the doctor's careful words settled into the space between hope and acceptance, River felt the news in her bones before her mother's trembling voice finished explaining. Time had become measured in weeks rather than months, comfort rather than cure, and Elena met this reality with the same grace she had brought to every season of her 84 years. River began spending evenings at her grandmother's bedside, reading aloud from books they had shared when she was small, their voices weaving together in rhythms that felt like prayers spoken in the language of memory. As Elena's energy gently ebbed like tide returning to deeper waters, River sensed profound changes taking place in the inner landscape she had known since childhood. A vast, sun-warmed garden where decades of careful living had created something extraordinarily beautiful. The invitation came during a peaceful afternoon when spring light painted the bedroom walls in soft gold. Elena's breathing settled into the deep rhythm of someone learning to let go with dignity. River rested her hand on the quilt Elena had stitched years before, feeling the familiar thinning of the world that meant sacred entry was possible, though this time the permission carried urgency, mixed with love, a desire to share something precious before it, transformed beyond ordinary. Reach, the landscape that welcomed River, was breathtaking in its preparation. This was a garden that had been lovingly tended for decades, every path worn smooth by years of mindful attention, every flower bed rich with experiences transformed into wisdom. But now the entire territory was orchestrating a great seasonal change, some areas naturally returning to wild meadow, while others bloomed with concentrated vibrancy, gathering all their beauty into one magnificent, final display. River understood that her grandmother was not fighting this transition, but conducting it with the same grace she had brought to every aspect of her life. Together they walked through memory gardens, where precious moments had been cultivated like rare orchids. First steps, quiet conversations over tea, small acts of kindness that had rippled through generations. Elena showed River how to gather these flower memories into bouquets that would live on in hearts that loved her, teaching that death was not ending but transformation. Like a garden preparing for spring in a different season, when River woke to find her grandmother's eyes open and peaceful, Elena pressed something small and warm into her palm, a silver thimble worn smooth by decades of mending. "For the places that need tending and the places that don't," she whispered, her voice carrying wonder rather than sadness. "I'm not leaving you, dear one. I'm just changing rooms." River learned that her gift extended beyond healing the living to honoring the sacred transitions that were part of life's larger rhythm, helping hearts prepare for changes that would transform them into something even more beautiful than what they had been before. The silver thimble Elena had pressed into River's palm carried more than the warmth of her grandmother's touch. It held the crystallized understanding. That tending was both skill and sacred promise, guiding River toward a path where her gift could serve the world through languages both ancient and accepted. In the weeks following Elena's gentle transition, River found herself mending small things almost without thinking. Loose hems on bookshop curtains, frayed edges on her father's cardigan, the thimble warming beneath her touch like a tiny hearth, reminding her that repair belonged to those willing to hold broken things with patience. The decision to study psychology felt less like choice and more like the natural unfolding of water finding its deepest channel. Applications were filled out at the kitchen table between cups of tea and Jaime's soft humming, the pen moving with the calm conviction of roots seeking nourishment. She chose a nearby university, so evenings could still end at the bookshop counter, where Mrs. Holloway wrote a recommendation letter that felt like blessing disguised as ink, and Patricia sent encouragement folded into a paper crane. Remember to close every gate with thanks. Her professors often found themselves puzzled by River's unusual intuition, her uncanny ability to ask questions that unlocked months of stalled understanding in both classmates and early practicum clients. Dr. Martinez, observing River's sessions through one-way glass, took careful notes on how she could create breakthrough moments through what appeared to be simple presence and exquisitely timed silence. Though the mechanism behind her effectiveness remained mysteriously elusive, River learned to weave her gift seamlessly into conventional therapeutic techniques, using her visits to clients' inner parks not as direct intervention, but as subtle compass. When she sensed overgrown paths of confusion in someone's emotional landscape, she would gently guide conversations toward areas of uncertainty, allowing them to discover their own way forward. Wilted flowers of old sadness became carefully crafted questions about unprocessed grief, while the presence of small animals in someone's inner territory guided her to explore themes of trust and vulnerability with perfect timing. The most challenging aspect was learning to contain her gift within professional boundaries while honoring its sacred nature. River developed rituals that helped her transition between ordinary therapeutic presence and the deeper communion of visiting inner parks. 3 slow breaths that felt like knocking gently on doors, and afterward, washing hands with the intentional care Patricia had taught her, letting emotional residue flow away while holding gratitude for the privilege of witnessing such intimate territories. Her reputation grew quietly, the way good news travels between people who have experienced something they can't name but desperately want to share. Clients would recommend River using phrases like, "She really sees you," or "somehow she knows exactly what you need to hear," though they could never explain the mechanism behind her unusual effectiveness. Through this deepening practice, River began to understand that her role was not to heal people, but to help them remember their own capacity for healing, to serve as bridge between conscious struggles and the deeper wisdom their hearts already carried. She was becoming a translator between the language of symptoms and the poetry of inner landscapes, helping people recognize that their emotional territories held not just pain but profound beauty, not just problems, but seeds of solutions, waiting patiently for the right conditions to bloom. The quiet success of River's therapeutic practice revealed patterns that lived in the spaces between conventional diagnoses and textbook explanations, drawing her attention to clients who carried experiences too delicate for ordinary language. She noticed how certain eyes would drift toward windows when discussing particularly vivid dreams, the hushed tones used to describe inexplicable sensitivity to others' emotions, the careful way some people moved through the world as if their skin were made of windows that couldn't quite close. These were souls who felt too deeply, dreamed too vividly, or simply existed slightly out of step with the ordinary world's rhythms. The idea for a support group emerged organically from these observations, less professional venture than act of gentle kinship. River created a simple invitation and placed it in quiet corners of the community. Libraries, independent coffee shops, the bookshop's front window. "Tuesday evenings for dreamers and sensitives," it read. "Tea provided. Bring your breath, bring your gentle." She arranged mismatched chairs in a loose circle among the poetry shelves, where late afternoon light filtered through windows painted with dust motes that danced like tiny spirits. The building's old radiators sang their sighing lullaby, while a plate of small sandwiches rested on a low table like soft promises that bodies mattered too. River never spoke directly about visiting inner parks, but somehow the right people found their way to these gatherings, individuals who had learned to hide gifts that didn't fit conventional categories. Marcus arrived early to the 3rd meeting, his winter landscapes now carrying patches of green where trust had taken root. Ms. Chen brought sketches that seemed to predict emotional weather, while Jaime provided gentle background music that created sonic sanctuary for stories beginning with, "I know this sounds strange, but..." Sarah, the psychology student River mentored, joined the circle and shared her ability to sense breakthrough moments before they arrived, her presence adding another thread to the tapestry of intuitive connection. New faces appeared with careful regularity. Tom lingered by the travel section after the 2nd meeting, his voice steady in the way steady can mean held very tightly. He didn't talk about dreams yet, but asked if the circle would keep meeting, his jaw loosening just enough to be human again when River promised the chairs would be there next Tuesday. A young mother spoke of her newborn who seemed to dream in colors, while an elderly poet whispered about weather that never fully cleared from the space above her heart. River facilitated with the same reverent attention she brought to individual therapy, understanding that many group members had spent years feeling isolated by abilities that were simultaneously profound and inexplicable. She asked for the feeling under the feeling, invited the room to breathe in shared rhythm, and offered simple practices that sounded like ordinary kindness. A hand on the back of the chair when memories rose too quickly, phrases to keep in pockets for crowded buses, ways of ending evenings that felt like tucking the room itself to sleep. The group became a harbor where sensitive weather could rest, revealing that River's gift was part of a larger spectrum of human sensitivity. Through these Tuesday evenings, she learned that healing happened not just in individual relationships, but in communities where people could recognize themselves in others' experiences, where unusual gifts could be honored rather than hidden, and where the simple act of being truly seen created conditions for natural resilience to remember itself. The gentle sanctuary of Tuesday evenings had slowly drawn forward, those whose inner landscapes carried the deepest scars, and it was there that Tom began the careful process of learning to trust again. He had been attending for months, his presence steady as weathered stone, listening more than speaking, his hands folded with military precision, while stories flowed around him like water around a patient boulder. When he did offer words, they came measured and deliberate, speaking of sleep that refused to be sleep, of sounds that could turn afternoon into midnight without warning. River noticed how Tom chose chairs near the travel section, as if keeping company with maps might help him remember ordinary roads existed beyond the territories where his mind often wandered. She offered him the same spacious attention she gave everyone, no probing questions, only invitations soft enough to be declined, small sandwiches placed within reach during breaks, the kind of gentle witness that asked nothing in return. When Tom finally requested individual sessions, his voice carried hope that had learned not to expect too much. They met in the bookshop's quiet back room, where afternoon light painted golden rectangles across worn carpet, and the distant hum of the building created its own peaceful rhythm. He spoke carefully about dreams that weren't dreams, landscapes that followed him from sleep into waking hours, and the way his body had learned to anticipate storms before clouds even formed. The invitation came after months of patient relationship building, when trust had grown deep enough to support what lived in his most protected territories. As Tom settled into the worn couch with the exhausted relief of someone finally safe enough to rest, River felt the familiar thinning of the world. Though this permission carried both desperate need and profound wariness, fragile as spun glass yet fierce as tempered steel. The landscape that received her was frozen in the amber of perpetual conflict. Trenches carved the earth like scars refusing to heal, while minefields of triggered memories made most pathways impassable. The sky held the bruised twilight of a storm that never quite passed, and the air itself felt heavy with explosions that echoed in endless loops, trapping the territory in cycles of reliving that prevented any forward movement. River understood immediately that this was not territory she could tend with her usual gentle tools. Instead of trying to clear dangerous areas or force light into spaces that needed their shadows, she found a small rise at the very edge of his battlefield and simply sat. Her presence became a steady lighthouse beam that said without words, "You are not alone in this place." Week after patient week, River maintained her vigil at the border of Tom's internal war zone. She brought no agenda beyond witness, no timeline beyond whatever his healing required. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, small safe zones began to appear. A smooth stone here, a patch of hardy moss there, a simple bench crafted from what looked like salvaged wood. Tiny islands of peace where Tom could rest between battles that still raged in territories too dangerous for immediate exploration. River learned that some healing happens in increments so small they're nearly invisible to ordinary measurement, but no less real for their subtlety. Tom began sleeping through nights without waking to phantom sounds, his shoulders carrying less tension in crowded spaces. The battlefield remained, but it was no longer the only landscape in his inner territory, and that small shift created space for something resembling hope to take root in previously barren ground. Through this work, River discovered that her gift could serve even the most wounded territories, not by fixing or forcing change, but by offering the kind of steady, unconditional presence that reminded traumatized hearts they were still worthy of tenderness, still capable of healing, even when that healing required geological time and infinite patience. The patience River had cultivated through months of sitting at the edge of Tom's battlefield prepared her for encounters requiring different forms of witness, though nothing could have readied her for the profound eloquence of Lily's silence. The 8-year-old arrived at the bookshop, carried in her mother's careful exhaustion, a portfolio of drawings tucked under Jessica's arm, like evidence of a language no adult had learned to read. Since the divorce, Lily had retreated into territories where words felt inadequate, speaking instead through swirls of color that pulsed with their own urgent heartbeat. Jessica spread the artwork across River's quiet table with trembling fingers, pages where purple sadness pooled in low places like morning fog, angry red thorns blocked pathways that once led to safety, and tiny spots of yellow hope hid like shy wildflowers in protected corners. "She draws storms," Jessica whispered, "but I don't know how to help her weather them." River understood immediately that this child was already speaking fluently, just not in the language adults expected. When Lily herself appeared the following week, she moved through the bookshop with the focused attention of someone reading invisible maps, choosing a chair near the poetry section, and immediately beginning to draw with fierce concentration. River settled nearby with her own paper, responding to Lily's chromatic conversations with gentle additions. Soft blue streams that could carry some of the purple weight, tiny bridges over red barriers, small shelters where yellow hope could rest and grow stronger. Their sessions became wordless dialogues, conducted entirely in crayon and watercolor, each meeting building understanding through shared creative territory. River learned that violet pools meant the deep ache of missing, that red thorns protected spaces too tender for casual touch, and that yellow stars drifted closer when Lily felt safe enough to let hope show itself. The invitation came during their 4th session, when Lily fell asleep, curled against the reading chair with paint still damp on her fingertips. Her breathing settled into the deep rhythm of complete trust, and River felt the familiar thinning of the world, though this permission carried the desperate hope of someone who had been trying to communicate in a language no one else seemed to understand. The landscape that welcomed River was breathtaking in its honesty, a world painted entirely in living emotion where feelings moved like weather systems across terrain that shifted with every heartbeat. River moved through this chromatic territory with reverence, understanding that Lily had created something extraordinary, an emotional geography so pure it could teach adults about the poetry living and feeling deeply. Instead of changing colors, River began tending the spaces between them, creating gentle transitions where purple could fade gradually into softer blues, where red barriers could develop small openings, and where yellow hope could find more room to spread. When Lily stirred awake, something had shifted in her posture. She reached for a green crayon, the first time River had seen her choose that color, and drew a small tree growing between the purple and yellow areas of her latest drawing. "Growing," she whispered, her first spoken word in months, and River understood that healing could happen in any language that honored the truth of what hearts needed to express. The word hung in the air like a bridge between worlds, proof that sometimes the most profound communication happened when someone finally felt safe enough to be heard. The small green tree that Lily had drawn, between her territories of purple and yellow, seemed to take root in the bookshop itself, its quiet promise of growth rippling outward, in ways River was only beginning to understand. Word of gentle healing traveled along the town's softest channels, through shared glances in grocery store aisles, conversations that paused at exactly the right moment, the way hope moves when it doesn't need to announce itself. It was through these invisible currents that Mr. Davidson found his way to River's door on a Tuesday evening when autumn light painted everything in shades of amber and forgiveness. River remembered him from 5th grade, when his classroom had been a sanctuary where every child's story mattered, where worried parents found patient listening, and where small triumphs were celebrated with the enthusiasm usually reserved for major victories. Now he sat across from her with shoulders that curved inward, like parentheses around something too heavy to hold alone, his kind eyes shadowed with the particular exhaustion of those who love too much without knowing where to set the weight down. "I keep everyone's stories," he said quietly, his voice carrying 30 years of accumulated caring. Every family crisis, every small breakthrough, every worry that follows children home, they all live somewhere inside me, and I can't seem to find the door that lets them rest. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke, not from fear but from the constant vibration of carrying emotional frequencies. That weren't his own. River recognized the symptoms immediately, the way caregivers could become so porous that others' emotional weather took up permanent residence in territories meant for rest and renewal. Over several gentle sessions, she taught him what Patricia had once taught her about professional boundaries, though she wrapped the lessons in language about visualization and stress management, never mentioning the deeper territories they were actually learning to tend. The invitation came during their fourth meeting, when exhaustion finally outweighed his practiced vigilance. Mr. Davidson fell asleep in the bookshop's comfortable chair, with the trust of someone who had found sanctuary, his breathing settling into rhythms that spoke of deep relief. River felt the familiar thinning of the world, though this permission carried both gratitude and slight embarrassment, as if he was apologizing for needing help with something he felt he should have mastered long ago. The landscape that welcomed River was extraordinary in its generosity, a vast library where he had been storing everyone else's stories with meticulous care, each narrative given its own carefully labeled shelf, organized by student name and year, tended with the devotion of someone who believed that holding others' experiences was love's responsibility. But the library had grown so large that there was barely space to walk between towering stacks, and nowhere at all for his own experiences to find a home. River worked with infinite patience, helping him create designated areas for student concerns, beautiful shelves that could be accessed during work hours and then gently closed with gratitude at day's end. In a sun-dappled corner, previously cluttered with forgotten anxieties, she created a private reading nook with a comfortable chair and warm lamp, a space where his own memories and dreams could finally breathe. When Mr. Davidson woke, he stretched with freedom River hadn't seen in months. "I dreamed I had my own reading room," he said wonderingly. Within weeks, he began leaving school at reasonable hours, tending his own small garden, and writing in a journal he kept by his bedside, proof that caring for others required first tending the caretaker. Within the space Mr. Davidson had reclaimed, for his own stories seemed to send ripples through the community's creative currents, like a single stone dropped into still water, carrying news that boundaries could be both protective and generous. River began noticing how local artists moved through the world with a particular quality of attention, their eyes tracking invisible weather systems, their hands often stained with evidence of translating inner visions into forms the ordinary world could witness and hold. Elena Martinez was the first to approach River directly, arriving at the bookshop on a Thursday afternoon, with fingers permanently marked by watercolors that seemed to shift hues depending on the light. She settled into the chair that had become sacred space for such admissions, her canvas bag releasing the scent of turpentine and possibility. "My portraits know things before I do," Elena confessed quietly. "Sometimes I finish painting someone's face and realize I've captured their grief or joy weeks before they're ready to acknowledge it themselves." Through gentle conversations that danced around edges of what couldn't quite be explained in ordinary language, River learned that Elena's creative process felt less like conscious choice and more like receiving transmissions from territories that existed just beyond the reach of waking consciousness. When Elena fell asleep during one of their evening sessions, exhausted from a day of translating invisible emotional weather into visible art, River felt the familiar invitation to witness something extraordinary. The landscape that welcomed her was breathtaking in its abundance, vast color gardens where hues bloomed in impossible combinations, pigments mixed from feelings too subtle for any earthly palate. Ideas for paintings didn't simply appear here. They grew like luminescent flora, each petal a potential brushstroke, each leaf a shade waiting to be discovered. Rivers of liquid light flowed between garden beds, nourishing creativity that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, alive and generous and utterly inexplicable. But River also sensed the challenges that lived in this territory, periods when the gardens dimmed, their paths overgrown with old fears of judgment, their light filtered through clouds of expectation and self-doubt. Instead of trying to force perpetual bloom, River learned to help Elena tend these creative landscapes with the same reverence she brought to every inner park, clearing emotional debris that sometimes choked the natural flow while honoring the necessary seasons of rest and renewal. Word traveled through the artistic community with the particular velocity reserved for secrets that desperately wanted to be shared. Marcus brought his friend David, a writer whose notebooks filled with stories that seemed to grow themselves while he slept. Sarah introduced River to a sculptor, whose hands shaped clay into forms that made people weep without understanding why. Elena mentioned River to a musician who spoke of melodies that arrived like shy birds, landing only when conditions felt completely safe. Through these encounters, River discovered that artistic inspiration was often the inner park's most generous offering, its way of sharing beauty, wisdom and truth with the outer world through willing hands and open hearts. Her role with these creative souls was to help them maintain healthy relationships with their internal wellsprings, teaching them to honor both the flow of creation and the necessary fallow periods, to translate inspiration without depleting its source, and to remember that the greatest art emerged not from force but from patient listening to the magnificent landscapes that lived within them, waiting to be revealed through whatever medium could best hold their particular light. The gentle network of artists whose inner landscapes River had learned to tend created ripples that eventually reached the shores of practical necessity. As her growing practice began to outgrow the cozy corners of her parents' bookshop, while the poetry section had served as sacred sanctuary for Tuesday evening circles, and the back room had witnessed countless quiet breakthroughs, River sensed that the work calling to her required space designed specifically for the delicate intimacies of healing hearts and tending invisible gardens. It was Jaime who discovered the cottage, their musician's intuition drawn to the way afternoon light moved across water like visible music. The small building sat at the edge of Mirror Lake, with the patient grace of something that had been waiting for exactly the right purpose, its weathered cedar walls breathing stories of previous inhabitants, a fisherman who had found peace in morning mist, an artist who had painted the changing seasons from windows that framed the water like living canvases. River felt recognition the moment she stepped inside, as if the cottage had been dreaming of exactly this kind of sanctuary. Sunlight pooled on worn wooden floors and moved with the lake's gentle rhythm, while windows offered views that changed like meditation throughout the day, sometimes mirror-still reflections of clouds, sometimes gentle ripples that caught light like scattered stars. The air itself seemed to hold a quality of deep listening, as if decades of quiet contemplation had seasoned the walls with peace. Together, River and Jaime arranged the rooms with the same reverence River brought to tending inner parks. They chose chairs that invited intimate conversation without demanding it, positioned to catch the best light while maintaining gentle privacy. A small table held Elena's grandmother's silver thimble beside a simple bell, reminders of both careful tending and the importance of returning home from deep waters. In the kitchen, they created space for brewing tea that tasted like liquid comfort, while bookshelves filled with volumes on gentle healing and the mysterious territories where psychology met something deeper than conventional wisdom. River designed the entrance with particular care, creating a threshold ritual as natural as removing shoes. A shallow bowl near the door held smooth lake stones, and visitors began developing the habit of choosing one, holding it while they breathed away what they were ready to release, then setting it gently in the bowl like a temporary offering to the water's ancient patience. The cottage's effect on visitors was immediate and profound. Clients spoke of feeling their shoulders drop the moment they crossed the threshold, as if stepping into a held breath they hadn't realized they'd been trying to take for years. Margaret, an elderly woman whose inner park had become overgrown with decades of worrying about everyone except herself, fell asleep during her third session with the deep trust of someone who had finally found sanctuary. When River visited Margaret's landscape that afternoon, she discovered gardens where solutions to everyone else's problems grew in careful rows, while Margaret's own dreams waited patiently in a small, neglected corner that needed only gentle attention to bloom. Word traveled through the community's softest channels, the way hope moves when it doesn't need to announce itself. People began arriving not just for sessions, but to experience the peace River had cultivated in the space itself, understanding that the cottage had become a bridge between the ordinary world and the invisible territories where real healing happened, where the lake's vastness could mirror the stillness they sought within their own hearts. Through this deepening work, River realized she was creating more than a practice. She was cultivating conditions where healing could unfold as naturally as seasons changing, where external sanctuary served as invitation to the sacred spaces that had always existed within every human heart, waiting patiently to be remembered and tended with the gentleness they deserved, the peace that had settled into the cottage's rhythms like morning mist over. Mirror Lake began drawing attention from beyond, their gentle community, arriving in the form of a handwritten invitation on paper that smelled faintly of mountain air and pine needles. The envelope bore the careful script of someone who wrote letters the way River tended inner gardens, with patience and reverence for what words could hold. Inside, an invitation to a gathering of quiet healers nestled in the mountains. 3 days where no credentials would be required, only the willingness to share what had been learned in the territories between conventional wisdom and inexplicable grace. Sarah, whose listening had deepened into something that could sense breakthrough moments before they arrived, asked with shy hope if she might accompany River to this retreat. River saw the readiness in her posture, the way Sarah's presence had learned to create sanctuary rather than demand attention, and nodded with the warm certainty of recognition. They packed simple bags with Jaime's thermos of tea, small sandwiches wrapped in brown paper, and a smooth lake stone that River tucked into her pocket like a traveling anchor to home. The retreat center sat among tall pines with the patient grace of something that had been waiting for exactly this purpose, its wide porch scattered with mismatched chairs that seemed to understand the art of comfortable silence. No banners announced methodologies or promised transformations, only a small bell on a weathered table and a pitcher of water beaded with mountain coolness, humble altars to the simple requirements of staying present. River found herself in a circle with others who moved through the world carrying similar mysteries. Elena, whose somatic work began with teaching bodies how to exhale stories they'd been holding in muscle and bone. David, an intuitive counselor who dreamed his clients' next steps before they did. Maria, who called herself an energy worker, but mostly described following warmth toward places that needed tending. And Thomas, a grief counselor whose grandmother had taught him lullabies that could help sorrow find its way to rest. When the small bell passed to River, she offered language that honored her truth without revealing the secret door. "I listen for the landscapes that live inside people," she said softly, her voice carrying the same reverence she brought to visiting inner parks. "Sometimes I bring a lantern for overgrown paths. Sometimes I water what wants to bloom. Mostly I sit at the edge of things until they remember their own capacity for healing." Heads nodded with the recognition of shared territory, and relief moved through the circle like a gentle breeze. Elena taught them a grounding practice, feet finding earth, tongue resting soft against the roof of the mouth, eyes unfocused enough to let the body lead. Thomas shared a simple ritual his grandmother had used, 3 slow sips of water to signal the end of difficult conversations, allowing both helper and help to return fully to their own hearts. Maria demonstrated how to sense the invisible boundaries where one person's energy ended and another's began, essential knowledge for those who felt too much too easily. As evening painted the mountains in shades of purple and gold, River walked among paper lanterns strung between pine branches, feeling threads of connection weaving between the gathered healers, not a net that trapped, but something like a warm shawl that offered comfort without constraint. She understood with quiet joy that her work at the cottage was part of a larger tapestry, each practitioner a thread steadying the others, each hand learning how to tend the sacred territories where real transformation bloomed in its own perfect timing. When River returned to Mirror Lake, she placed a small wooden bowl, a gift from Maria, beside Elena's thimble and the simple bell, creating what she quietly called ways to return home. She began ending sessions with those 3 ceremonial sips of water, and clients noticed something they couldn't name. They left feeling as though someone had packed them a sandwich for the journey ahead, carrying with them the warmth of being truly witnessed in the landscapes of their own becoming. The wooden bowl from Maria and the mountain retreats, gentle rituals settled into the cottage's rhythm like stones finding their place in a streambed. And with them came a deeper understanding of River's purpose, that extended beyond individual healing into something more lasting and profound. Sarah moved through the cottage's rooms with increasing natural grace, her presence creating the kind of quiet sanctuary that allowed others to remember their own capacity for peace. And River began to recognize in her student the fertile ground where ancient wisdom could take root and grow toward future generations. The teaching began organically, woven into shared tasks that held their own quiet significance. As they arranged chairs for Tuesday evening circles or prepared the 3 ceremonial cups of water that ended each session, River offered observations disguised as casual conversation. "Notice how Mrs. Patterson's breathing changes when she speaks about her garden," she might murmur, while folding blankets. "See how David's hands still when he finds words for something true." Sarah absorbed these lessons like earth receiving gentle rain, asking few questions but sensing much, her natural intuition sharpening with each careful observation. River recognized the moment when Sarah was ready. For deeper guidance, it arrived in the way her student had learned to hold space for difficult emotions without trying to fix them, how her questions could unlock doors that had been closed for years, and most tellingly, how she seemed to sense the invisible territories that lived just beneath the surface of ordinary conversation. On an evening when autumn painted the lake in shades of copper and gold, River made a decision that felt like water finding its natural course. "There are landscapes that live inside people," she began carefully, watching Sarah's face for signs of recognition. "Places where memories grow like gardens, where feelings have their own weather systems, where healing happens according to laws older than any textbook." Sarah's immediate nod carried relief rather than surprise, as if she'd been waiting years for language to describe what she had always sensed. The opportunity for Sarah's first conscious practice arrived with Mrs. Chen, the flower shop owner, whose heart carried decades of tending others' beauty, while her own grief remained carefully contained. As the elderly woman settled into the cottage's embrace, with the deep trust of someone who had found sanctuary, River felt the familiar invitation and gently guided Sarah to recognize it too, the particular quality of breathing that accompanied complete surrender, the way the air itself seemed to thin with permission. "Feel for the doorway," River whispered, her hand resting lightly on Sarah's shoulder. "Not to enter, just to sense its presence. Let her inner territory show you what it needs." Sarah's eyes widened with wonder as she sensed what River had been describing. A memorial garden where every flower held a memory of Mrs. Chen's late brother, tended with such devotion that even grief had become beautiful. Instead of trying to change this landscape, Sarah understood intuitively that her role was to witness its sacred nature, to sit quietly beside the memorial bench and let her presence honor the love that persisted beyond loss. When Mrs. Chen stirred awake, she spoke wonderingly of dreaming that her brother's garden had received gentle visitors who understood that some flowers were meant to bloom forever. Sarah's eyes met River's with quiet joy, recognizing that she had crossed a threshold into territories where healing happened not through technique but through the sacred art of witnessing truth with complete reverence. Through this deepening mentorship, River began to understand that her purpose extended beyond individual healing into cultivating a lineage of gentle gardeners who would carry forward the work of tending human hearts with skill and humility, ensuring that the quiet wisdom of inner landscapes would continue, flowing through the world long after her own hands had learned to rest. The morning River first understood that her work had begun, growing beyond her careful tending, arrived wrapped in ordinary mist over Mirror Lake, the kind of soft gray that makes the world feel like a held breath, waiting to become something beautiful. She discovered the truth in Marcus's sketchbook, left on the cottage table beside, a cup of tea still warm enough to suggest he'd been waiting for exactly the right moment to share what he'd been quietly documenting with an artist's eye for invisible patterns. The pages revealed something that took River's breath away with its elegant mathematics, intricate maps showing how healing had learned to seed itself through networks she'd never consciously cultivated. Marcus had traced the flowering with careful precision. Margaret's newfound ability to receive care had somehow transformed her book club into a sanctuary where conversations grew deeper than anyone expected. Tom's hard-won peace had created space in his veteran support group for wounds that had been circling unspoken for years. Ms. Chen's rekindled creativity had inspired her students to take artistic risks that surprised everyone, including themselves. Each person you helped became a gardener, Marcus explained softly, his finger following connections between names and dates, like constellations in a map of invisible stars. They're tending other people's capacity to bloom. River felt wonder settle in her chest as she recognized the profound ripple effect. Former clients had become more compassionate friends, more patient parents, more generous community members who seemed to carry an innate understanding of how to hold space for others' struggles. The evidence lived everywhere she looked, now that her eyes had learned to see it. Lily, whose childhood drawings had once been storms of purple and red, was studying to work with children who spoke in languages adults hadn't learned to understand. Mr. Davidson had started a Friday reading hour, not for students, but for teachers, creating sanctuary for caretakers to rest their voices and hear their own hearts again. The Tuesday Circle had spawned 3 other support groups, each one seeded by someone who had first found their voice in the bookshop's gentle corners. Sarah appeared in the doorway with her own small notebook, documenting similar patterns with the careful attention River had taught her. "It's like watching a garden plant itself," she said wonderingly. "People who learn to tend their own inner landscapes are creating conditions where others remember how to bloom." Together they sat by the window, watching morning light paint the lake in shades of gold and understanding. While somewhere in town, a maintenance worker left chalk near the playground path so children could draw stars where pavement cracked, as if reminding the earth that light could arrive from the ground up. River touched Elena's thimble, then the simple bell, feeling gratitude flow through her like warm water. She had thought her gift was about visiting individual inner parks. But now she understood she had been cultivating something far more beautiful. A living network of gentle connection, where healing could spread like wildflowers, taking root wherever hearts were ready to remember their own wild capacity for love. Her role was shifting from active gardener to quiet witness, watching with deep joy as the work had learned to tend itself, flowing through the world in ways she could never have orchestrated, but could only receive with wonder, like morning light touching sleeping flowers and teaching them, without words, exactly when to open. The understanding that healing had learned to plant itself through invisible networks settled into River's bones like the memory of a lullaby, preparing her for the most extraordinary night of her life, though it arrived disguised as ordinary sleep, on an evening when autumn painted the cottage windows in shades of amber, and the lake held stars like captured prayers. She had fallen asleep to Jaime's soft breathing beside her and the gentle sound of water lapping against the dock. Marcus's constellation map still spread across the table, like evidence of miracles, when something unprecedented began to unfold in territories deeper than individual dreams. River found herself standing in a vast landscape that seemed woven from threads of every inner park she had ever tended, a collective territory where the boundaries between individual hearts had dissolved into something more beautiful than separation. The familiar winter paths from Marcus's territory stretched ahead, but now they were marked with small green flags where new growth had taken root, and gentle bridges arced toward other landscapes, willow branches that had learned to find water across impossible distances. He walked first through the memorial gardens she had witnessed in grief-stricken hearts, where flowers of remembrance bloomed alongside the creative color fields of artists' inner worlds. Ms. Chen's gallery stood with doors once locked, now breathing open, their moving paintings casting gentle light onto pathways that wound through Jaime's musical meadows, where trees chimed with silver threads and streams harmonized in perfect rhythm. The sturdy hedges from Patricia's healing garden created quiet sanctuaries marked with familiar signs, open with intention, close with thanks. Former clients appeared as gentle spirits in this interconnected space, not as River had known them in their individual struggles, but as threads in a larger tapestry that revealed profound truth. Marcus moved through landscapes that now held patches of every season, his artistic eye capturing beauty in territories that belonged to everyone and no one. Tom sat on a bench he had crafted himself near a stream that flowed freely through what had once been his battlefield, the sound of water replacing echoes of conflict, his presence creating safe zones where others could rest between their own battles. River discovered Lily's chromatic gardens, where purple sadness now exhaled into blue without breaking, and a small green tree cast forgiving shade over a picnic cloth spread with simple sandwiches, and a note in a child's rounded handwriting. For anyone walking a long way. Mr. Davidson's library opened beyond, shelves realigned so there was space to sit and read one page of one life without losing track of one's own, his reading lamp glowing like an ember, while the chair beside it waited with the good kind of patience. As River walked deeper into this shared dreamscape, she understood with quiet amazement that all healing was ultimately connected, that every person's inner landscape was part of a larger, more magnificent whole, a collective garden where individual transformation contributed to something greater than the sum of its parts. The memorial flowers in Mrs. Chen's grief garden had somehow seeded comfort in spaces where other hearts were learning to say goodbye. The creative streams flowing through Elena's artistic territory nourished inspiration in landscapes belonging to people, whose names River would never know. She felt the presence of other gardeners moving through the collective territory, some she recognized from the mountain retreat, others who worked in languages and territories she couldn't name, but understood in her bones. They tended connections between healing hearts with the same reverence she brought to individual inner parks, nurturing invisible streams that carried comfort from one person's recovery to another's readiness to begin. Even Whiskers appeared as a gentle spirit, his purr a soft vibration in the air as he strolled along moonlit paths. A permanent resident in this collective garden of healed hearts. Overhead, clouds moved like careful hands smoothing bedsheets, and far above, stars arranged themselves into 1,000 small questions with the same answer. Together, River spent the night in this extraordinary space, witnessing how individual acts of gentle witness had woven themselves into a living network of support that existed beyond any single person's awareness. She sat on a mossy bank beside streams that babbled with children's laughter and the deep comfort of old memories, feeling herself become part of the landscape, her own inner park, merging seamlessly with the greater whole, breathing with the rhythm of countless hearts, remembering their own capacity for healing. When morning light touched the cottage windows, and River woke with dew in her hair and the faint taste of starlight on her tongue, she found her cup of tea warm again, as though someone had kindly refilled it in the night. The dream lingered not as fading memory, but as felt truth, a quiet certainty that her gift had never really belonged to her alone, but had been in service to something much larger, a collective awakening to the sacred territories that lived inside every human heart, still breathing gently in the vastness of the world, humming its gentle song in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, the taste of starlight that lingered from River's night in the collective dreamscape, settled into her understanding, like morning dew finding its perfect leaf, carrying with it a profound shift in how she moved through her days at the cottage. The revelation that healing had learned to plant itself through invisible networks meant her role was naturally evolving from active gardener to something more like a patient lighthouse, whose steady beam could guide other healers toward remembering their own capacity for sacred witness. Sarah moved through the cottage's rooms with increasing grace, her presence creating the kind of sanctuary that allowed others to exhale stories they'd been carrying alone. River found herself stepping back with the satisfaction of watching a garden learn to tend itself, entrusting more of the daily sessions to Sarah while she felt called toward a different kind of service. When Dr. Martinez from the university called with a request that felt less like coincidence and more like the universe arranging its own gentle curriculum, River understood the invitation immediately. The workshops began in the cottage's main room, where River arranged mismatched chairs with the same reverence she had once brought to visiting inner parks. Therapists and counselors arrived carrying their own quiet mysteries, social workers who dreamed their clients' breakthroughs, grief counselors who sensed when someone was ready to let go, family therapists whose presence seemed to create conditions where truth could finally be spoken. River never spoke directly about visiting inner landscapes, understanding that the mechanism was less important than the principles that governed gentle healing. "We'll practice the art of listening with our whole being," she would begin, her voice carrying the soft authority Mrs. Holloway had once offered in library corners. She taught them to sense the emotional weather that moved through rooms, to recognize when breathing invited deeper conversation, and to trust the subtle wisdom that emerged when they stopped trying to fix and simply offered steady presence. Her exercises felt like meditation, but were actually training and recognizing the invisible boundaries where one person's emotional territory ended. And another's began. River adjusted chairs by a breath's width so everyone could see the lake as a single ribbon of light. And she prepared simple sandwiches cut into gentle triangles that felt like unspoken promises. You won't leave empty. She taught through small intentional gestures, how she poured water with complete attention, how she returned a gaze without entering it, how she placed her palm flat on the table when grief rose that wanted ground more than words. Sarah moved through these circles like a steady tide, demonstrating the quality of attention River was describing simply by embodying it. Between formal workshops, River began hosting what she quietly called supervision circles monthly, gatherings where practitioners could bring their most challenging cases and receive the kind of gentle witness they offered their own clients. These became sacred spaces where healers could admit their own need for tending, where the weight of constant caring could be shared among understanding hearts, and where the mysterious aspects of their work could be honored rather than explained away. Strange, gentle things began to happen. A seasoned therapist realized his clients grew calmer simply because he had learned to end sessions with 3 sips of water and a shared look toward the nearest window. A school counselor discovered that moving a chair 6 inches transformed weekly crises into conversations that could breathe. A hospice worker confessed that humming under her breath, only as loud as starlight, helped families remember how to rest together. Nobody could explain why any of it worked, but they carried these practices into rooms River would never enter, and the healing continued to spread. Through this teaching, River discovered that her deepest gift had always been recognizing the sacred nature of human healing and helping others remember their own capacity for reverent service. She was becoming a teacher of presence itself, showing others how to create conditions where natural resilience could remember itself, where healing could unfold according to its own perfect timing, and where the simple act of being truly seen could work transformations no technique could accomplish. As winter deepened around the cottage and the lake held ice like captured silence, River felt herself settling into this new role with the satisfaction of water finding its deepest channel. She was no longer the active gardener of individual inner parks, but the keeper of wisdom about gentle tending, cultivating a quiet revolution that spread through networks of compassionate souls who would carry this understanding into their own practices, their own communities, their own ways of moving through the world with hands that knew how to hold broken things with infinite patience. The cottage became a place where healers came to remember what they already knew, and River understood that she was building not a monument, but a living, breathing garden, a legacy that would continue expanding long after her own hands had learned to rest, rooted in the profound truth that every human heart carried. Within it a sacred landscape waiting to be discovered and tended with the kind of love that makes flowers bloom in the darkest soil, the wisdom River had distilled through years of teaching. Gentle healers began, seeking a more permanent home as winter painted the cottage windows in frost that looked like captured prayers. And the lake held silence so complete it seemed to be listening for something just beyond ordinary hearing. The transition from active teaching to this new calling felt as natural as seasons changing. Sarah now facilitated the supervision circles with grace that needed no guidance, and the network of compassionate practitioners had learned to tend itself like a garden that remembered its own capacity for growth. River found herself drawn to the cottage's quietest corner during the hours when dawn painted the world in shades of possibility. A smooth wooden table that Jaime had crafted from driftwood, holding paper that seemed to glow with its own patient light. She placed Elena's silver thimble beside the simple bell, poured 3 ceremonial sips of water in the tradition Thomas had taught them, and chose a lake stone from Maria's wooden bowl. Small rituals that created sacred space for words that wanted to travel beyond her lifetime. The letters began as conversations with healers not yet born, written in the language of growing things that could translate across generations and cultures. "Dear tender of invisible gardens," her first letter began, the pen moving with the same reverence she had once brought to visiting inner parks. "You will discover that every person carries within them landscapes of extraordinary beauty. Forests where deep thoughts process and heal, meadows where authentic joy can finally breathe, streams that carry both sorrow and relief toward the sea. She wrote about the fundamental principles that had guided her work, never mentioning her specific gift, but offering the wisdom it had taught her. One letter explored the art of presence, how healing happened not through fixing, but through the simple act of bearing witness to someone's truth without needing to change it. Another described boundaries as sacred shorelines rather than walls, places where compassion could flow generously without depleting the giver. A third focused on recognizing readiness, teaching future healers to sense when someone's inner territory was prepared for tending and when patience was the kindest offering. Between paragraphs, River would rest her palm on the page and listen to Jaime's soft humming from the kitchen, where tea steeped in ceramic pots and simple sandwiches waited on plates painted with wildflowers. The music wove itself into the letter's rhythm, creating what felt like lullabies disguised as guidance, gentle enough to soothe and strong enough to carry truth across decades. Each completed letter was folded with the care of someone, tucking a child into bed and placed in a cedar box that Jaime had crafted during long winter evenings, its surface worn smooth by loving hands until it felt like something the earth itself had offered. The box grew heavy with accumulated wisdom, letters addressed not to names but to qualities, for the one who listens with their whole being, for the keeper of sacred thresholds, for the gardener who tends what cannot be seen. When spring's first green touched the cottage's windows, River carried the box to the bookshop where her journey had begun, placing it on the shelf between poetry and philosophy, where Mrs. Holloway's chair still held the impression of decades of gentle wisdom. She wrote a simple note for the cover, to be opened by whoever needs these words, when the time feels right for receiving them. Standing in the bookshop's familiar embrace, surrounded by stories that had taught her about the territories of the human heart, River felt the profound satisfaction of completing a circle. The letters would wait patiently in their cedar sanctuary, breathing softly among the volumes of poetry and philosophy, ready to offer guidance to future gardeners of the human heart, who would carry forward the sacred work of tending invisible territories with infinite patience and boundless love. The act felt less like ending and more like planting seeds in soil she would never see bloom, trusting that the right words would find the right hearts at precisely the moment they were needed. Continuing the ancient conversation between those who recognized that healing was sacred work and that every person's inner landscape deserved reverent attention from hands that knew how to hold broken things with the gentleness that makes flowers bloom in the darkest soil. The seasons that followed, River's gift of letters moved with the unhurried grace of someone who had learned that the deepest healing happens not in dramatic moments, but in the accumulated tenderness of countless small acts. And as her hair grew silver as candlelight on water, the same gentle illumination that had welcomed her into the world, River discovered that her final calling was to tend her own inner landscape with the same sacred attention she had brought to every territory she had been privileged to witness. The cottage by Mirror Lake had become a living repository of healing, each room breathing with the presence of hearts that had found their way back to wholeness within its walls. The chair where Tom had learned to trust again seemed to hold an eternal warmth, while the corner where Lily had first drawn her green tree still hummed with the quiet courage of a child, teaching adults about the poetry of feeling deeply. Jaime's guitar rested near the window like a faithful companion, occasionally resonating with breezes that carried melodies no composer had written, but everyone somehow recognized. River spent mornings walking the shoreline with Elena's thimble warm in her pocket, understanding now that her own inner park had become something extraordinary, a vast sanctuary where every person she had helped continued to bloom like perennial flowers, requiring no tending, but offering their beauty freely to anyone who happened to pass through. The winter paths from Marcus's landscape wound through meadows bright with Miss Chen's impossible colors, while streams of Jaime's music carried the gentle wisdom Mrs. Holloway had shared in library corners decades before. Sarah arrived each Tuesday with the quiet authority of someone who had learned to trust the invisible, territories that lived between heartbeats, bringing news of the memorial garden being created in the town. Square, simple benches bearing plaques that read for sitting with difficult things and for resting. Between brave moments, the Tuesday circles continued in the bookshop, now facilitated by a rotation of gentle souls who understood that healing happened best when witnessed by hearts that had learned their own capacity for resilience. Thank you. Notes appeared regularly in the cedar box, folded with the care of prayers, and signed only with pressed flowers or children's drawings, evidence that the letters were finding their intended recipients across distances. River could no longer measure but trusted completely. She saved these offerings in a tin that had once held tea, a small archive of lives quietly turning toward light, proof that healing had learned to plant itself through networks more intricate than any garden she could have imagined. As her own great seasonal change approached, River felt herself not departing but expanding, becoming part of the collective landscape that existed in the spaces between one heartbeat and the next. Her inner park had grown into something that belonged, not just to her but to everyone whose healing had taught her about the sacred territories that lived inside human hearts, vast meadows where hope could finally breathe, quiet streams that carried both sorrow and relief toward the same forgiving sea. On the evening when stars arranged themselves into their ancient question mark above Mirror Lake, River understood that her gift had never been about visiting other people's inner landscapes, but about recognizing that such parks existed in everyone, including herself, waiting patiently to be discovered and tended with the kind of love that asks nothing in return but the privilege of witness. She closed her gates with gratitude, left the cottage door breathing gently open, and felt herself becoming part of the larger garden that would continue blooming long after her individual season had transformed into something even more beautiful. On quiet evenings, when the light grows soft and the world settles into its gentler rhythms, River's spirit still tends the gardens that bloom inside every human heart. She moves like a whisper through the landscapes of memory and hope, reminding us all that we carry within ourselves parks of incredible beauty, waiting to be discovered and tended with the kind of love that makes flowers bloom in the darkest soil. And somewhere, in the space between your last conscious thought and your first dream, she's still there, lighting small lamps along the pathways of your own inner territory, humming lullabies that sound like coming home. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.